Hello, and I'm delighted to welcome Peter Donohoe, CBE, concert pianist and Vice President of the Birmingham Conservatoire. Peter, delighted to have you on board. Thank you very much for doing this interview.
Julia.
Hello.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. Let's start with your childhood and how did you get into the piano playing?
It was really kind of weird, actually, because I don't have a musical family, really, except that my mother, I'm an only child, and my mother had played the piano before I was born. But probably because I was born, she stopped. I don't really know exactly the reason. But it did mean that she didn't play professionally, but she had learned and she was quite good. And we had a piano as a result of that in the house. When I was first born, it was a small apartment, but then we had a house a little bit later. And I was attracted to it in a big way. I obviously, like children are, I was making noises on it, playing like this, you know, because I was quite small then, unlike now, sadly. But there was a Christmas party at my nursery school, the equivalent of a kindergarten, and one of the staff had written a carol, which I can remember now. And I came home and tried to pick it out on the piano. And that was when my family realised that I really did have some kind of leaning towards it and wasn't just making a noise on it. And the main thing was that it started on the dominant. And in this particular case, I chose C as the dominant. So it was in F major, which meant that later on in the tune, it had a B flat. And I couldn't work out why I couldn't get the B flat to sound right, because I kept on playing a B natural. And my grandfather, who lived with us, actually, he was quite an intelligent natural musician, I think, himself, although he'd never actually learned officially to play anything or to sing, but he just could. And he suggested, I think, to my parents that the fact that I found that sounding wrong meant that I'd got some kind of musical ear and they should develop it. And that really was the beginning. So it was thanks to Mr. Taylor of my kindergarten who wrote the tune. And that made that was a watershed moment for sure, because I really did try to pick out melodies properly instead of just slapping the keyboard like most children do. And it never stopped since.
And let's talk about your practice when you were young. So obviously piano playing requires quite a few hours. Were you a very diligent child?
Well, I was just going to say, my initial response to that is, well, it won't take very long to talk about my practice because I tried not to do any. My teachers and parents, they were pulling their hair out because I didn't practice properly. All I ever did was mess with the piano, making things up, improvising essentially. And when I was set a piece to learn, I was always adding to it and putting completely inappropriate mordants and things like that in it, and harmonies that were not right. They were quite nice harmonies, but they were nothing to do with Mozart, you know, that kind of thing. I had to be disciplined. It took a very long time to persuade me to stop doing that kind of thing, but I did stop in the end. Practicing properly was, of course, I was told endlessly how to practice properly, but I never took any notice of it. I can honestly say until I was in my early 20s. And then I started to practice really seriously. But of course, until then, I'd played endlessly, just played, not taking it that seriously. In fact, I didn't really have my eyes set on a pianist's career until much later than most people have. But I was playing all the time, and I was playing lots of other instruments, and quite seriously playing other instruments. I knew I wanted to be a musician, but the idea of a career plan was just a complete anathema to me. I just fell into the whole thing endlessly.
Well, it sounds fascinating. So basically, you don't remember a moment before your 20s when you were, let's say, trying to improve your technique or specifically working on certain musical pieces to improve it?
Well, it's difficult to not sound complacent about it, but I have a natural technique. And in particular, I have a natural technique that revolves around the arms and wrists. And anything that involves speed, when I was younger, I don't really know, maybe it's actually a problem. my musical mind worked very quickly, which meant that I tended to play things very quickly all the time. And it's actually taken most of my professional life to try and slow it down, because I hear things too quickly, that's for sure. And so it's taken quite a lot of training, self-discipline, to realise that and to really do something about it. When I was, I suppose, in my teens, I was learning endless numbers of pieces, but just not really properly. That was the thing. And of course, a lot of it was involved accompanying other people as well. Lots of chamber music, lots of duos with friends, accompanying diplomas, things like that. I did a lot of it. And I did actually, not particularly seriously, because I took an external ARCM when I was 16, in 1968, it would have been, or something like that, 69. And so, you know, I must have been able to do something reasonably well. It's just that it wasn't focused in a way that I very definitely became, probably suddenly, in my early 20s. Suddenly I thought, I'm being really lazy, basically, not to take it as seriously as everybody wanted me to. And so I did. Actually, the stimulus for that in the end was an invitation. I think it was as a result of having played the piano part in Petrushka, Stravinsky Petrushka, which has an orchestral piano part that's quite prominent. And I did that with the Halle Orchestra in Manchester, 4 performances, I think. And the conductor was coincidentally looking for someone to open what they used to call their summer prom season. And on the basis that he just worked with me, and probably also that I wouldn't have charged very much money, they decided to book me to do the Paganini Rhapsody of Rachmaninoff. I have an idea they thought that wasn't a difficult piece, because it's not called concerto. But my God, it is. It's one of the hardest pieces, really, by Rachmaninoff. And I didn't play it at that time, but I had something like 4 months' notice or so. And so I did do that, and it led to a professional soloist career, having kind of dithered for so many years. So that conductor, James Lochran, he was called, principal conductor of the Halle Orchestra, he was absolutely pivotal in what I do, making that decision.
Yes. But talking about your first engagement, were you actually nervous about it? Did you think, oh my God, this is such an important occasion?
Yeah, I did think so, because I thought it was a make or break moment. I suddenly realised that that's what everybody wanted me to do. And there was something in me that made me want not to let them down, I suppose. Until that time, I was doing recitals, by the way, by then, but I never took them very seriously. But the Halle Orchestra is a major organisation. And I was born in Manchester, and the Halle dominated the Manchester music scene, still does, always has done. And so I found it a very important psychological moment. And in any case, it's a very difficult piece. And there were very good musicians in the orchestra too. And I knew some of them because I used to play in the percussion section of the Halle Orchestra professionally. So, you know, they were friends. One feels the pressure very much to deliver when they've trusted you to do so. You must, I think, make sure you do absolutely as well as you possibly can. So yes, I was very well prepared, probably for the first time in my life. And it was a good result. It went very well, and they re-invited me, and so did many other orchestras who followed them. So it was really a very important start to something that's been going on now since 1976.
Sure.
That was when it happened.
Yeah.
And actually, by the way, 1976 was the year I ceased to be a student. I left the Royal Northern College at that point. Didn't really cease studying, because I went off to Paris to study with Messiaen and his wife Yvonne Laurier. But I'd finished my official course. And that date with the Halle Orchestra came 2 days after I left the RNCM, which is an omen. You know, it's like, I always thought, and I still think, the first few years after being a student must be the most difficult bridge to cross. And the Halle Orchestra helped me cross it. So
yes,
I'm indebted to them forever, really.
It's very interesting. So it's actually not the competitions that started, you think, your career, is that engagement
No,
by the orchestra. Mm-hmm.
the competitions came, well, actually, the first two competitions I did were that year because I developed a very strong interest in Liszt, and there was the composer list, I mean, and there was a nationwide UK competition run by the British Liszt Society that I entered in that year. It's only ever happened once, as far as I know. The winner was Terence Judd, who tragically killed himself about 3 years later. But Terence won. Martin Roscoe, my two-piano colleague, and best man, by the way, we were second and third. And so that made me feel that I wasn't too bad at competitions either. So I went on to do the Bartók list in Budapest, same year. I didn't do so well in that. I was a finalist, but that was it, just a finalist. And then the Leeds competition in 1981, and 82 was Moscow Tchaikovsky competition, which outside the UK was the most decisive thing that's ever happened to me. Within the UK, I was already quite well established, so it was the icing on the cake, really.
Interesting.
In fact, for years after that, most of what I did was outside the UK as a result of that competition. But it's obviously, it wasn't really necessary to win a competition, but I thought I'd give it a go.
Do you think now it's important to win a competition?
It's definitely different to the way it was then. We're talking about 1982 during the Cold War. In fact, a year later, one of the most tense moments of the Cold War. And the idea of going to the Soviet Union and throwing down a challenge to the incredible Russian pianist was something that, well, I was very nervous for that too. But I also was very cheeky, so, you know, there was a conflict within. But that was a very big moment in my life because of the political importance of the competition and the significance of it. That's changed. We don't have the Cold War anymore. We have hundreds, literally, of competitions all over the world. Excuse me. And we also have hundreds of kind of permanent competitors, they're kind of circuit performers who are financially able somehow to enter as many competitions as they possibly can. On the whole, they are intending to win one of them, obviously. And if they do, then that's a very big moment for them psychologically. I wouldn't say that it's that winning a competition anymore has as much significance as it did then, simply because of the numbers involved. Sure. And of course, I've been involved in competitions because I've been a jury member several times now in very large number of places, large and small, including the Moscow competition. And it is different to the way it used to be, for sure. So many times, the winner is a great success for that moment, but that then leads to an opportunity to continue on and to show what they can do. It doesn't have any guarantees of anything. It probably never really did, but it had more of one in those days because of the significance of each one.
And can I ask you, just from your experience of being a jury member, what are the, let's say, key factors for preparation and also for the performance on the day?
By the competitors or by the jury members?
By the competitors.
Well, first and foremost, they must be ready to win. Secondly, they must be ready to lose. Because, you know, if for example, in the present day Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow and Leeds and almost any major competition now, essentially you're talking about being one of upwards of 30 people who enter, and somebody has to win, which means 29 people are probably not going to win. Or in the earlier days, it was even more than that. When I entered, it was 104 in the first round. The chances of winning are actually very, very low, however well you play. So you have to be prepared to simply not, and not to take it as a personal insult or to hold a grudge about it, or to even take it as a judgment of your playing, because it isn't really. It can't be. It's so dependent upon the day, dependent upon the jury member's taste, depending upon the repertoire you chose. All manner of things can affect that result. And so one has to be very prepared to take it as an opportunity to try to get lucky. It's really as simple as that. If you really are by far the best who's entered, then of course, unless the jury's very unfair or stupid, which does happen, then they're going to win. But when the level, as it almost always is, the level is always very high, right from the very beginning of every competition that of every competition I judge now, the level is always very, very high. And so you're talking about choice between very good pianists. There's no rights or wrongs. There's only taste and conviction and something intangible that you can't really put into words as a jury member. As far as the preparation, I have to say this, even though I know you didn't intend this as the question, but as far as the preparation for the competition is concerned for the jury members, I don't think many of us do it very well. I think it's very important to know every piece that everyone's playing. Hopefully that you play the pieces yourself in concert. But if you don't, certainly study them, because you're in no position to make a value judgment otherwise. And when I sit next to people who've never even opened the score, for example, of the commissioned work for the competition, they don't know anything about it. I wonder how they can have an opinion. My feeling is that, you know, when people criticize the world of competitions, which they do all the time, I think it's basically they're criticizing, if they think about it, they're criticizing the quality of the people who are judging, not the institution of the competition. There's nothing wrong with having competitions, but there is something wrong with running them badly. And that is something that one has to work very hard to try and, to try and improve the level of the way they're simply, not run really, but the way that they're judged. There are some wonderful people on competition juries who really want to be absolutely right about their choice, who want to be very careful about the people they don't choose, and who have got a very good attitude towards the whole thing. But there are some who spoil it, I have to say. And of course, I can't go into any details about it, but I have had conversations that really would terrify you. It's not really, I've said this many times before, there's a very big difference between stupidity, manipulation, racism, arrogance, the feeling that they know better than any of the rest of the jury, that sort of thing. There's a big difference between that and institutionalized corruption, which I think I say we, but I think the competition world has been accused of that many times. I don't think that exists, but the other things do sometimes. And there's no, by the way, many people say, well, why do you get involved? To me, I mean, and the reason I get involved is that if I don't, somebody else will. We have to try to maintain a level of reasonableness. And I'd like to think that I don't think like that I do have at least an attempt at a fair attitude towards the competitors. And there are many of us around. I would say probably that aspect of competitions is improving. I think the people who are on juries on the whole are very good people now. There have been a few bad apples in the past.
Thank you. And
I hope I'm not one of them.
I just wanted to ask another question about, so what matters when a competitor goes on the stage? Do you just listen, like with your eyes shut, or actually do you take into account the posture, how nervous someone looks?
Well, those specific things, the posture and how nervous they look, I would only take those into account if they showed in the way they played. Sometimes posture can be really bad and the result can still be great. Sometimes enormous nervousness can be there and it actually helps sometimes. No, I wouldn't. I really wouldn't take those seriously unless I was making notes for the benefit of that competitor for later to say perhaps why something hadn't worked very well, and maybe your posture or your nervousness was showing something like that. What do I do? Well, to be totally honest, and in retrospect, what I actually do most of the time is take notes that I then send to everybody, if they ask for it, at any rate. And whilst I'm writing those notes, I'm obviously not sitting with my eyes closed. Between writing things down, I tend to close my eyes and listen. I've even been accused of being asleep because of that before now, but it's actually untrue. And then I open my eyes and make a note if I think of something that I should say. And it's really interesting to look back. The ones who play in such a great way, one tends to actually not write anything down. You just listen. It's when you have something to say that's negative that you write it down, which is probably not a good thing. You should write it down, whether it's positive or negative, but you tend not to. So looking back, the ones who've got lots and lots of notes are the ones I'd had the biggest problems with, which is, it's just one of those things you suddenly realize about yourself in retrospect. It's a very interesting experience to do it, though. I must say that it tests your ability to concentrate. It makes you realize that there are certain times of day where it's more difficult to do so. And that, of course, applies to the performers as well. If you get, the 9 a.m. slot at the beginning of the first round of the competition, then it's difficult for everybody. And we jury members have to take that into account, to actually know that the first person is going to be more nervous than anyone else, probably, and that the jury hasn't really got into gear properly yet. And I always feel very sorry for people who draw from the ballot that they will play first. It's a really miserable situation to be in. The one who plays last is definitely in an advantageous position.
Interesting.
It's a little bit like if you have an alphabetical order of competitors, the one whose name begins with A or the one whose name begins with Z, they have a very different life, basically, particularly if they're in a catalogue. If you look in the gramophone, as we used to call it, the gramophone classical record catalogue, if you looked in there for a recommended recording of a very popular piece that's been recorded by a lot of people, the people whose name begins with A are always at the top of the list. It's just the way things are.
Oh, Peter, fascinating, really, this insight, and thanks you. But let's go back a little bit to your education. And I understood about your technique that came naturally to you. But let's talk about your studies with Messiaen. How was it for you?
Well, it was stimulated by my admiration for him, as not only as a composer, actually, but as a great teacher of other composers. And I was quite interested in the idea of me becoming a composer at that point. It wasn't a very serious attempt. I had written some pieces, but it turned out they were by somebody else most of the time. So, and I wasn't really cut out for that. I wrote a lot of things, though. It's just that they weren't worth publishing. But when I went to Messiaen for that reason, I also admired his wife's performing very much. She was the dedicatee of almost all his piano music. She was somewhat pigeonholed, as we say in English, as the performer that you turn to for Messiaen, which sounds very nice, except that what she said to me was that because she's never turned to play anybody else's music, which I think was something that really got her down. But she taught me a lot about the performance of French music. Not specifically about his music, because she didn't really want to teach his music. She'd had enough of it, I suspect. Messiaen himself used to talk to me about life. He talked to me about religion and the role of religion in music, and in particular in his music, because he was a very profoundly dedicated Catholic, and it shows in everything he wrote. which I'm not, by the way, not at all. So we discussed the validity of a performer of Messiaen's music who was not religious. And that was a very interesting discussion, which I could tell you about that for 3 hours easily. And the role of music in society, which of course becomes progressively more and more important to understand, particularly, by the way, during lockdown and the possibility of what will happen after it, which is something I'm thinking about all the time, and always have, actually. What role does the music have in our society, in the modern world, and what role do I have in that? It's a very fascinating thing to think about, because it, as Messiaen's provoked, you start to think about the historical significance of it and how it's changed over the hundreds of years that classical music has been, as we know it, has been in existence, and why it's there and why we do it, why we listen to it. It's a very interesting subject, and it does make you rethink the way you play it, actually. In fact, over the years, there have been many things that have made me rethink what I do. And when I think about the way I used to do it in the past, I don't want to hear it again. You know, when you rethink something, you're sort of disowning what you did before, which I think I have. But then almost every musician says the same. You know, every time you do a concert, you wish you'd done it in a different way. Every time you make a recording, you have no desire whatsoever to hear it again, because you want to record it again without fail. That is just the way it is. It's a little bit like being in the sports world. You know, every time you do a long jump at the Olympics and you don't actually win, but you could have done, you want to do it again, don't you? Except you can't.
Can I ask you what were the examples where you felt you really changing something in yourself? Could you share with us?
Well, the biggest moment, I think, was when for decades as a soloist, professional soloist, I have, like everybody, a tendency to have been marketed as associated with certain music, certain repertoire, certain composers. And I started out before the competition in Moscow, which was my biggest publicity moment. But before that, I started out being associated very largely with the contemporary repertoire, the then contemporary repertoire. That was in the 70s, of course, rather different composers to the ones that are around these days, mostly. And also, in those days, at least in the UK, we used to, or most people used to regard music from the 20th century, post-First World War, as virtually all dissonant, unpleasant, and not really music. It was like a dirty word. If you mentioned the name Bartok, or Stravinsky, or Schoenberg, or any of them, really, any of the major 20th century composers, Shostakovich, strangely, was the one that people had heard of the most, I think, in this country. It was like it was a dirty word. Debussy and Ravel were very lucky to get past that. Somehow they were associated with earlier emotions, maybe, despite the fact that there were two of the most significant 20th century composers of them all. They were not really associated with the 20th century in the same way that Rachmaninoff wasn't, I suppose because he wrote tonally in his case. But all of these other major names, the revolutionaries, that was what I wanted to play. That's because I was a rebellious spirit. I had a rebellious spirit. And I was very much part of the 1970s hippie movement, at least the British version of it. I was very much against nuclear war and all that kind of, well, we're all against it, I know, but I was really terrified about it. And I was always marching and protesting and all that kind of stuff. And so the rock music of the time, I was also interested in it because it was so anti-establishment. So that was my personality. So I thought, well, I'm going to play Bartok. You know, everyone hates it. I'm going to play it. Or Schoenberg, or, well, actually Messiaen later. Not for the right reasons, probably, because I've now completely rethought the way that those composers should be played. But that went on. Then came to the Moscow competition, and immediately I was marketed as a specialist in Russian romantic repertoire, which is what happens to all people involved in that competition. And so I had to fight that little category as well. The whole time this was going on, it was the Viennese classical repertoire of Mozart, particularly Mozart, not so much Beethoven, Mozart and Haydn and Schubert, that I was terrified of. I just knew that it wasn't for me. That at that stage in my life, I just really couldn't play it very well. I was asked to do quite a few of Mozart's piano concertos, and they seemed to be all right. But nobody else seemed to think they were lousy. But I just couldn't take it. I just felt so nervous of the repertoire. And I think in 2013, I think it was, I was doing a tour of South America, playing the same thing everywhere, which was the Van Regard by Messiaen, the complete Van Regard, Sur l'Enfant Jésus, which is a whole concert and extremely dissonant and very, very loud, some of it, very extreme, put it that way. Great music, I think, and very, very emotional. And it was a continuous string of concerts, which of course made my fingers very sore, because one performance is enough to break all your nails. And I was doing them more or less every 2 days, or in all sorts of places. So I was feeling sore, and I was feeling slightly jaded and a little bit kind of, well, almost punch drunk. And I was preparing for one of the performances. It was in a city called, I can never say it, Medellin is the way I would say it, but in Colombia. I think they say it differently, but I'm sure you know what I mean. And I was practicing briefly in the afternoon, and it was almost like I had a visitation. And this may sound very fanciful, and I know that it is fanciful. It's just in my mind. I felt like I'd had a visitation from Mozart, who came and said, "It's time.
Wow.
It's actually time for you to stop being frightened of it and get on with it." In other words, it's okay to have been frightened of it for 50 years, but it's now time to do it properly. To actually, because I always loved it. I always played through it privately, thousands and thousands of times, particularly when I was a child. All those sonatas and variations and everything. And I decided, yes, okay, I agree, I'll do it. So I committed myself to several performances of the complete cycle of Mozart sonatas and a recording, which is now halfway through being released. 6 CDs in the end. We've released 3 of them so far. And that has changed everything. It's changed my attitude to every other composer as well. The way I play is different, very different to the way it was before. And it was caused by that moment. I love these moments, you know. Of course, Mozart didn't come to me. It was in my own head, but it really felt very powerful. And yes, there was something in my subconscious that had been saying for all those years, "You're not ready yet." And then suddenly I was. At least I think so. As ready as I'll ever be, put it that way. And so, you know, the recordings of the Mozarts have been very, very nicely received. In fact, I was overjoyed by the reception, because I really thought that I didn't stand the chance of being received well playing that, because it's not something I'm associated with. But it was received well. And I'm so happy about that. It means that I did the right thing to wait for so long. And it is the greatest music in the end, I think, probably of all. So, you know, it does take time. The slightly startling thing is that he was 35 when he died, which is not far off being half my age now. So the idea that you need to be terribly mature to play it, there is that obstacle. He wasn't mature himself, but his music making wasn't it? It was just incredibly natural. And the sign of a great composer is the impact they have on the next generations of composers. And he's had immense impact on virtually everyone since. So it is the greatest music. And of course, contemporaries of his all are equally difficult, Haydn and early Beethoven, to say nothing of the earlier music of Bach and Handel. That's another world that I've yet to really take seriously. That's not the right phrase, but I'm sure you know what I mean.
Yes.
This Mozart cycle of sonatas, which are actually more difficult than the concertos, I think, has been just an absolute eye-opener. And I said before, it's changed the way I've played other things. If I play a work by Tchaikovsky now, maybe because Tchaikovsky was such an admirer of Mozart, but even without that, the way I play it's different. For sure it is. I know it is. I can hear it if I listen to myself back. I just know that things have changed. So I'm rejecting everything that I played before 2013, effectively, aren't I?
Can I
Nobody
ask
else
you,
seems to be rejecting it. But
yeah, can I ask you about your, of course, repertoire and the way you handle it all? I mean, it's a huge, vast repertoire. And are you a quick
yeah,
learner? I suppose you're a quick learner.
too quick. I am too quick at learning it. I said quite a long time back in the interview that it's perhaps not a good thing. It's because it's downside, put it that way. I have got a very quick memory. There's no point in trying to make to sound modest about it. I was born with a good ear, with a good memory and a natural technique, which meant that I could learn things probably too fast. You know, the result of doing something too quickly is that you haven't done it properly. It's really as simple as that. So I have to put the brakes on. But yes, it does. It goes in and stays there. It's not reliable in the way that a photographic memory is. I don't have one of those. So I can actually forget in performance simply through nervousness, as we all can. It's not that you've actually forgotten the music at all. It's that somehow there was a little block caused by the situation. That happens. But basically, it's too fast.
Mm.
as
And
is the I don't know, things like the trills that I used to play, or the tremolos, or anything like that. It was always too fast, and I found it I could never understand what people were saying to me when they said it. You know, slow it down. And it sounds slow enough to me, but then you hear a recording, and it isn't. Simple as that. Your brain is, or my brain is working too quickly, or it was. I think I've slowed it down now, and maybe it's slowed down on its own because I'm old. Could be. I better make sure it doesn't get too slow.
may I ask you about, you mentioned you get nervous, and why, I mean, of course, everyone get nervous, but in what way do you get nervous? Is it sort of blocking your mind, or is it just basically, the audience or critics?
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably changed over the years. I don't think it would be any of those every time. When I have been very dissatisfied with something because of nerves, it's had two results. One of which is I come off thinking I've not played at all properly, that everything was sketchy. And the other rather unexpected result is that sometimes it receives a better reception than when I've felt comfortable about it. So people have responded to perhaps the electricity caused by the nervousness. You know, most people, when they listen to a concert, they don't necessarily know, and they certainly don't care if you play something inaccurately. That's not that important. What is important is you've communicated something, and I have to compromise. I have to deal with that conflict between the possibility that actually, if I was comfortable with it, it wouldn't be so communicative as when I am uncomfortable. It's one of those endless battles. You just never solve the problem, you know. It's a very interesting aspect of the human psyche, that's for sure.
You have
And
any
of course,
routine?
why are we doing it?
Yes. Do you
A
have any
routine before
routine
you?
before the concert?
Not really. Except it's very important to me that I've slept as much as I can, and that I'm not cold. If I'm not hungry, if those things are satisfied, I think, well, you just take it as it comes. It's probably best not to be angry as well, because sometimes one is angered by some sort of idiotic omission in the arrangements, something like that. But most of the time, there's none of that. Most of the time, people are doing absolutely everything they can to make it work well, and we all have a stake in that, of course. So I don't like the idea of a rigid regime, because if you fail to follow it, then it will undermine your confidence in the performance. I have come across some people who had funny ones, You know, because I ran a festival for so long, I encountered all kinds of demands from people who were doing the same job as me, and they would, you know, they want a camp bed that's 2.5 feet off the floor in the dressing room, and a supply of toilet rolls to throw around in a rage before they play, and to remove the tension, all sorts of strange things. No, don't do that. I would recommend that you avoid that. If you've got a tendency that way, just fight against it. Because if they can't supply 140 toilet rolls for you to throw around, you will be further nervous and your concert won't go well. You mustn't rely on things like that.
This is hilarious.
I've heard of people say, oh, some very funny things go on. I've heard of people sawing the legs off the piano stool because it was too high. Which of course means it wasn't too high at all. It means that everybody else comes along and they're playing like I did when I was 9, you know, because the piano stool has been completely ruined forever for everybody else. Things like that. Yeah, I would try to avoid that if you possibly can.
Sure. I just wanted to actually come back to the education again, that you mentioned you got a lot of interesting things from Messiaen's wife. Could you share if there are any kind of broader ideas that we can use?
It's quite difficult to do, actually. And it was in 1977 anyway. I've forgotten some of it. But, you know, it's more of an overall thing that all my teachers have communicated to me in slightly different ways. It's to do with confidence, to do with not being nervous of climaxes, for example, in the music. To actually almost go against the sort of teaching that a lot of children have, where they're told not to bang. Well, of course they mustn't bang. You've got to work out a way of avoiding the sound that banging produces, not being afraid of the biggest moments, which is something completely different. And I think being afraid of big moments is something that's taught endlessly, very badly. It's a very silly thing to say. It means that the music's incoherent because it doesn't lead anywhere. And I don't mean the biggest climax of the Liszt sonata or anything like that. I mean the arch shape of a phrase in any music. To actually not be afraid of the moment that is the high point. And every phrase has got one. It's also got a low point. It's also, you know, let's take Mozart as an example. There is always an ending to the phrase which needs to be quieter than, usually anyway, needs to be quieter than that which comes before it. And if you're too quiet already, it's not going to happen. That sort of thing. I think that's about confidence. And every teacher I've had has built my confidence wonderfully. I've been very lucky with that, particularly the first one. My first piano teacher, well, actually my mother was the first one, literally. But then I was sent off to this wonderful man who was chosen. His name was Alfred Williams, and he was chosen entirely on the basis that he was the closest to where we lived. He lived down the road. And talk about lucky, he was a great teacher, you know. My parents didn't know how to choose a great teacher, but he was one. And everyone else since has been. And I would say that talking to other musicians who aren't necessarily pianists themselves, who are playing other instruments, conductors in particular, or singers, and talking to Messiaen, they were all very similar. It was all like, don't be afraid. You know, first of all, establish what you really believe your role to be, and don't be afraid of it. Do it. And if it's to communicate, well, not being afraid of climaxes, that's something that I've noticed every time I've done a masterclass, is that thousands of people are. They go underneath it. It's like they prepare a huge climax in a piece of Rachmaninoff, or any music really, but the romantic Russian composers are the most obvious in that sense. The climax is very, very definitely at a certain point. And they build up to it, and then they just go under it and sort of miss it because they're afraid of it. Don't be.
What are the biggest...
But of course,
yeah, go on.
Well, it's important to say this about piano playing generally, is that so many of those things that come from being confident are entirely dependent on your ability to play in a big way without being harsh. In other words, the development of your sound is enormously important. is because if you haven't got a sound that will cope with the fortissimo without it being harsh, then you need to rethink it. It mustn't be a battle between sleepy and aggressive. You know, where it's piano, it's sleepy. Where it's forte and upwards, it's aggressive. It mustn't be that. It's always got to be beautiful. It doesn't really matter how loud it is. It's always beautiful. That was actually a Messiaen quote. This is a composer of hugely dissonant music. Enormous noise sometimes. Well, noise is the wrong word, of course. It mustn't be noise. However dissonant it is, however accented, however loud it's marked, it's still beautiful. Everything with Messiaen was joy. The joy in the existence of the universe. You know, all that was his thing. And what God has created. And so, you know, all those incredible dissonances, they were actually the sounds of bells, analysed by this incredible musical mind. They're not something to give you an excuse to play harshly in. And that was a real eye-opener.
And what do you think are the biggest challenges now for younger musicians, so people at the start of their career?
Well, we touched upon it with the competitions. You can avoid having to go through the competition world. It is possible. There are some examples. Lang Lang, Yu Jia Wang. I'm trying to think of some others. Perhaps Paul Lewis. I'm not really sure that he ever did competition. I don't think he did. There are ways of doing it, but you've got to find another way. You can't just use avoiding competitions as a way of getting a career. There has to be a substitute. The substitute can be, I don't know, friendly conductors, or big business promoting you, or it can be connections with an already famous name or something. I don't know how I would have done it without it, because I didn't have any of those. I think that probably the most important thing is to get on with competitions and stop being put off by people who say they're bad things, because they're only bad things if you don't play well, and if people who are running it don't do it very well. So choose your competition carefully, and it's a little bit like starting out in business. You know, everybody wants a good job. There's an interview for one very good job, and there'll be 120 people going for it, and they choose one of them. It's lucky, but for that person, it's great. You know, they choose one of them for reasons. Of course, they have reasons, but there may be more than half of them who are perfectly eligible for the job. You can only have one. That's the problem. That is something that's quite simple, I think, to get as a concept about competitions in the competition world. There's only one, unless you have a joint winner, which does happen, I know. But just assuming that complication aside, putting that aside, there is only really one person who's going to come away from a competition being totally happy. And everyone else has lost. They haven't actually lost anything. They certainly shouldn't lose their confidence. But they should learn from it. That's the essence of it. And then keep on trying. Every competition that is feasible and that looks as if it's run well, that's got a good jury, enter it. And one day, if you're very lucky, you'll win one. And if that happens, then it gives you confidence. I don't know how else to say it, really. There are so many pianists that, by the way, there's a very big influence with it. And I'm saying this without any kind of, well, I'll just say it. Without any kind of preconception or anything that's in any way biased. But so many of them are from China, because China has this incredible belief in music, in Western music, and they train their young people in a way that we have failed to do. And so they have literally thousands of good pianists. I'm saying pianists specifically, instrumentalists with great pianistic talent and great training. It's and it is a very interesting byproduct of my experience as a jury member, by the way, that almost every competition has a kind of interview round. They call it the first round. It's sort of establishing that you can play the piano at all. And they almost always have a Scarlatti or a Bach Prelude and Fugue, a Scarlatti Sonata or a Bach Prelude and Fugue, and some etudes by Chopin or Liszt or Rachmaninoff or Scriabin or something like that. Well, if you've got fantastic level of training in the younger generation of a certain country, they're the ones who are going to get through to the second round. Because if you go to a competition as a Westerner, which this is our tendency, you go there with a wonderful ability to play the Liszt Sonata or whatever, Petrushka or some major later work that's bigger. You probably won't get the chance to play it at all because you didn't do your etudes. You didn't get your Bach sorted out. And people from countries like China, it's not just China, it's Korea, it's Malaysia, it's many others. And in fact, to some degree, it's Japan as well. They will come with that first round prepared immaculately. And that makes such a gigantic difference to their fortunes in the competition.
I think everyone is very, very eager to learn. How long do you practice for, and what was the longest you've practiced?
Well, it's only ever happened once, which was just immediately before the competition in Budapest, that I did 13 hours in one day. 13 hours, yes. Well, no, you don't do that regularly. For one thing, you can barely sit down afterwards. For another, you've overdone it, and you don't have any social life whatsoever. And that probably applies at any age. So the image of someone practicing and doing virtually nothing else with their life is a romantic one. I don't think it's really possible. It's probably not very productive even if you did do it, because you're depriving yourself of experiences which must go into your music making. Well, what I do now, which is very different to what young people should do, by the way, we have a very different result. What I do now is basically keep my fingers from seizing up. If I don't have anything to play for the few days, and this of course is particularly significant at the moment, then I just make sure that every day I do something, and that something is very often exercises. I do quite a lot of five-finger technical exercises, mainly by Hannon. Now, most pianists would think that should be associated with beginners, but it's not. It's a very good way of training your fingers and making sure they don't go downhill.
So Peter Donohoe. So Peter Donohoe is playing Hannon basically every day. Amazing.
Well, sometimes it's adjacent days, yes. Maybe once a week, something like that. At one time, it really was every day. If I had a concert the next day, it was quite religiously so. It was very good for playing the day before a concert, not really on the day itself. When you're younger, you're busy learning pieces. I have to say that it might sound very non-creative of me, but the time has come when essentially I'm not likely to learn any new pieces. It's not entirely true, but in fact, I'm involved in a major project now, which I can't really identify at the present time, which does involve learning some new music. But the last time I really did a major well, no, in fact, I already knew the Mozart sonatas. It's just that I was performing them for the first time, you know. So that I've given up on all of that. I did my bit of learning contemporary music when I was younger. I did a huge amount of it. I commissioned pieces and I played lots of new pieces. So I don't really need to practice. Of course, it's an exaggeration, but I don't need to practice the works that I'm playing particularly. I need to think about them. I need to listen to other performances maybe, or listen to my own sometimes. It's not a question of making sure that I can play them, because I can. If there are any composers listening, they may well feel that I'm doing the wrong thing. But I have done a huge amount of new music in my time, and the time has come for somebody else to. I'm not a new pianist, you know, so the music needn't be new. I've always wanted to play traditional classical repertoire. That's what I entered the profession for. But I found myself really quite good at learning pieces for the first time that nobody else had ever played before, just because of the way my brain works. But the time has come for me to really concentrate on the music that I've always loved, which is the traditional classical repertoire. When I say classical, I include romantic, of course, and 20th century, but I don't include things that are being written at the moment. It's not really my scene anyway. The role of music has changed, and the style of new compositions has changed with it. And I'm beginning to feel like an old-fashioned purveyor of the past, you know. And one of the interesting things about the lockdown is that one of the things it's provoked me to do is to try and tidy my own music library and CD collection and LP collection as well, and to sort of reduce it in size. And it's unbelievable how much music I've been sent over the years. The weight of it is quite staggering, of new pieces, some of which are very well written by good composers. I just can't do anything about it. I'm sorry. And I have always thought, really, even when I was playing so much new music, I've always thought, well, why aren't you playing it? You're the composer. Why aren't you presenting it to the public? Like Chopin did, like Liszt did, like Rachmaninoff did. And he was quite recent. You know, Busoni, endless of these interesting composers, fantastic composers.
Yeah, as well.
Yeah, Prokofiev, exactly. Even if it's only conducting it, when I say only, I know that's incredibly hard to do well, but they don't have to be instrumentally trained to be able to. I mean, Tippett can conduct his own music, and a wonderful composer. Messiaen played the organ and the piano wonderfully. They would do his own pieces. But one of the fault lines that runs through the whole of well, not the whole, large amounts of contemporary repertoire is that it's written by people who don't play anything. And it shows. You need to be able to identify with the difficulties of performance in order to write well. As simple as that. The other thing is the abolition almost of four-part harmony in the Bachian sense, and polyphony, and the training of your ear when you're a student has meant that so much music is lacking in musical grammar. Regarding the way that traditional harmony and counterpoint and so on has been withdrawn essentially from the state school curriculum. In fact, music essentially has. Of course, there are many who still believe in it. There are still many oases of very highly trained and training teachers and therefore highly trained students and pupils. I am fully aware that almost everything that one says in an interview, by definition, is a generalization. But the generalization is true, and it has led to a lack of musical grammar in composers and maybe even instrumentalists. We don't have the awareness of the way the music from the past in particular was constructed that we used to have. And I think it's a very big mistake because it's changed the way we play it, not for the better. Again, a generalization, but it's largely true, I think. I think it's really quite a good phrase, that musical grammar. Does it lead somewhere? And you know, a lot of composers in the old days, when I say the old days, and when I was young, they made a living, some of them anyway, by writing for TV and film. And I've watched quite a lot of TV in my time and films, and the degree to which the music has become so utterly, pathetically irrelevant since the days when there were some really good composers doing it. No musical grammar. All I seem to hear in most of the things I watch now is long notes that don't have any connection with each other. Just long notes. What's the point of that? I hope you're making a good living at it, because I wish I could make a good living out of writing a few long notes. It's just utterly wrong. And now when I think back to the days of the Hollywood composers, who were mostly exiles from maybe Soviet Union and certainly Nazi Germany, who ended up in America, writing this incredible music for the films, being criticized for it, by the way, sometimes, but that was wrong. You know, when you think of the music to Tom and Jerry, written by Scott Bradley, just incredible. And also, I don't know, Corn Gold, and there were a whole host of them. The one of my favourites is Mission Impossible, you know, written by a genius composer. Not necessarily someone who's going to go down in history as a great philosophical composer of landmark music, but fantastic writing. You know, where's that? And it's the same problem that we have with what we call serious music, serious art music. And of course there are exceptions. I know there are exceptions. One day I'll play some of the exceptions, but most of it, I'm sorry, you know. That was one of the results of lockdown, was to find this incredible waste of paper. I could build a bonfire.
But Peter, what are your thoughts on the current situation of the classical music? Where is it going to lead us all?
Well, there are two possibilities, one of which is very pessimistic and the other isn't. The pessimistic one is that it'll never get back to where it was, and we will not basically have a music profession anymore. And there's a lot of people who are genuinely frightened of that being true. You know, the idea of going to a concert and having to be over 2 meters from your neighbor in the concert means that the concert hall can't basically be financially viable. That's quite worrying. And I, of course, have no medical knowledge. I have no reason to make any statements about the future with regard to the actual virus, but I do suspect that it's come very suddenly, and we've simply not learned to deal with it yet. And I suppose in the long-term future, the whole of our race, when I say race, I mean species, I don't mean race, will somehow be able to deal with it. The dreadful thing is that in the meantime, people are dying. You know, it's absolutely beyond belief that it could happen so suddenly and so many people become so ill that they die. But that's not really going to affect the long-term future of the music profession. That wasn't the question, I know, but it is absolutely desperate that can happen. The optimistic side of it is that we'll simply go back to normal one day. It'll take a long time, though. It's definitely going to be different for a long time, but we will slip back to the natural way, I think, I hope, as we will, you know, in everyday life, or restaurants or bars or anything like that. It will slip back to the way it used to be, but it'll be slow and it will produce casualties. And one can only hope for the best. I think we do have an innate need for not just classical music, but for entertainment, for pop concerts, for the idea of perhaps to some degree being passive, along with a lot of other people being passive, admiring a performer and the music, in our case, that performer is producing. I think people need that. Maybe as a replacement for religion, I don't know, but something like that. So if we need it, we're going to do it. Somehow we're going to do it. And that's my optimistic thought. The other possibility, of course, is that, you know, it's all right for me. I've been through a long and very, very lucky career. If it all finishes now, I can complacently say that I'm all right. I can write a book or something to keep me busy. But I will miss it hugely if that happens. But it won't happen. I don't think so.
Well, last question, really.
What do I know?
Yes.
Can I just during the lockdown, I was very lucky. I've always been lucky during my life. Incredibly lucky. I don't know, it's like there's a guardian angel. I did the last concert of a chamber music tour of Russia on the 29th of January in the British Embassy in Moscow. And it was with the Sacconi Quartet of the UK, playing Taneyev piano quintet, which is an astonishingly wonderful piece, I think, and almost unknown in the UK. And immediately after the concert, I'd had a skinful, I suppose, at the British Embassy, and I went back to my hotel and fell over in the bedroom, really quite badly, and injured my shoulder. As a result of which, I couldn't play at all. I haven't played publicly since, partly because of that, partly because of the lockdown. In other words, it came at the same time as the lockdown. And I can only say I'm lucky, because if it had happened when I was supposed to be playing all over the place, I would have had to have cancelled everything. So it came just at that time. And what was really incredibly lucky was that it's what's called the rotator cuff in the shoulder that was torn, which means you can't lift your arm up, basically. So you can't even raise it to the keyboard. It didn't affect the finger technique at all, but it did affect the arm, which of course is serious in piano playing. I went into hospital to have that operated on, a microsurgery, on the very day immediately before all the British hospitals closed down for everyone other than coronavirus patients. And I was literally the last operation in the building. So lucky again.
Yeah.
It was my daughter who persuaded me to have it looked at, because I thought, well, I'll just leave it to get better. But she said, because she's in the medical world, she said, I don't think it'll get better. I think you need to have it x-rayed and checked properly. And she pushed me into going, and I did. And the doctor did say, well, it will improve, but it will never recover unless you have this operation. And so I did. And it is improving hugely now. And I think I could do a concert now. There isn't one going, but I could do now. But it's the first week really since that happened that it's been possible.
Fantastic.
The other thing is that I did a tour of China in November, and I came back with the most god-awful virus. And I'll just leave people to imagine what that might have been. Officially, the first person to catch coronavirus appears to have been December the 22nd. And that was a Chinese doctor, I think. That was officially the story. I was there in November. I returned to the UK, arriving on the 1st of December. And I never got over whatever I'd caught until the middle of March. Whatever it was, it's been very unpleasant. I have to say now, March the 16th, I woke up that morning and thought, it's gone. It had just gone. Everything overnight had just cleared, and I've felt very healthy since. But those first 3 months, including falling over, they were horrible. Yeah. So whatever it was, I'll leave you to imagine. The other thing about lockdown, musicians on the whole, I'm sure many of the people listening to this will agree, we do have a tendency not to notice untidiness because we're too busy thinking about music and practicing and all that sort of thing. I noticed it for several years, but I didn't do anything about it until this happened. And I thought, well, I can use my left arm to tidy things up because it's my right shoulder that was injured. And now I'm using both of them. And tidying up that music collection and the CD collection, again, hundreds and hundreds of unwanted CDs. The notes that come with the CD, the paper thing that's inside, you can recycle those. It takes ages to get them out of the box. You have to be quite violent, actually, to get it out at all, particularly the bit at the back. But I've done it. It took me about 4 hours or something to take it all out of this CD collection. You can recycle the paper. You can't recycle the CD or the case. It's all going into landfill. And I think that is so wasteful. It's unbelievable that they won't accept it into the recycling area, because there are so many millions of CDs in the world that nobody really needs. I'm very happy to have seen the back of them. They're actually not at the tip yet. They're in the garage, but they're going to go. And it's just unbelievable amount. In fact, I posted on Facebook a picture of all of the CDs themselves on a garden cane, so that it looks like a slinky, if you know what I mean by that. So many of them. And no, I'm not going to identify whose CDs I'm throwing out. Not at all. I've kept a few, but not that many. We don't need it. So there we are. Oh, by the way, none of the ones I've kept are mine, just in case anybody was wondering. I've made several of them. I don't want to hear them. But that's for other people to listen.
That's the revelation. Peter, thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful interview. We've covered so many topics and so many questions. It's been a pure delight. And I wish you full recovery with your shoulder and hope to hear your wonderful music again. And thank you for joining.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. I'll be back on the circuit when anyone else is. Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.